Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm here today with a new installment of my series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are still on Chapter 3, and in today's lecture, I will cover from page 93 to top of page 97. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, and I highly recommend them, you already know that Freire starts this chapter by explaining dialogue, then goes on to explain the creation of a dialogical self and its role in pedagogy, but also its role in politics. So I've also recorded a separate video on the pedagogical self itself. I do encourage you to watch it. But today I'll mostly be discussing how he develops the concept of dialogue into a kind of dialogic teaching, which is in opposition to the banking model of education, but also involving a dialogical kind of politics, because he has now started combining the project of education with the project of politics. So let's see what he says. As always, I'll first read parts of the book and then come and briefly talk about them. Let's go to the first set of readings. For the anti-dialogical banking educator, the question of content simply concerns the program about which he will discourse to his students, and he answers his own question by organizing his own program. For the dialogical, problem-posing teacher-student, the program content of education is neither a gift nor an imposition, bits of information to be deposited in the students, but rather the organized, systematized, and developed representation to individuals of the things about which they want to know more. Authentic education is not carried on by A for B or A about B, but rather A with B, mediated by the word, a word which impresses and challenges both parties, giving rise to views or opinions about it. These views, impregnated with anxieties, doubts, hopes, or hopelessness, imply significant themes on the basis of which the program content of education can be built. In its desire to create an ideal model of the good man, a naively conceived humanism often overlooks the concrete, existential, present situation of real people. Authentic humanism, in Pierre Furteu's words, consists in permitting the emergence of the awareness of full humanity as a condition and as an obligation, as a situation and as a project. We simply cannot go to the laborers, urban or peasant, in the banking system to give them knowledge or to impose upon them the model of the good man contained in a program whose content we have ourselves organized. Many political and educational plans have failed because their authors designed them according to their own personal views of reality, never once taking into account, except as mere objects of their actions, the men in a situation to whom their program was ostensibly directed. So here we are. The main themes that we have seen in the book so far are still prevalent, but now he is focusing on the actual aspects of practical pedagogy, right? So that's why it starts with a reference to the banking model of education, which we already understand believes the students to be passive recipients of the information. And what he's trying to then teach us now is the actual practice of it. And what he's suggesting is that we cannot take our education or our knowledge to the peasants or the workers as a gift. Here we have something to give you. Nor we can impose it from top down, right? That would be the banking model of education. And it won't be authentic humanism. It would be kind of a pseudo-humanism, which assumes that those dispensing knowledge know what constitutes constitutes a fully realized human being. So how would it come about, right? The kind of education that he's talking about, in which there is an exchange and there is a dialogue, has inscribed in it the world as understood by the people with whom you are working. So it is not education for, right, from A to B, it is education with. So that means that a clear understanding of the world in which the peasants and workers live is absolutely necessary. But not just that, that they must have a voice in their own education or in their own political situation. So the role then is for anyone who claims to be an authentic teacher is to go to the people, right? To ask about their lived experiences, about their understanding of the world. Then, in dialogue with them, develop a curriculum or a political program that incorporates that, right? That is crucial, right? And what he's then implying is that any program, may it be educational or political, is bound to fail or is bound to replicate the old oppressive order if, it is created in a boardroom or somewhere detached from the people and then paraded out and dropped in a community and said, here, we have a program for your own betterment. Because that doesn't incorporate in it the voice, the experience, the anxieties, the hopes and fears of the very people that it is trying to serve. Now, these are insights of great import. I mean, if you look at the 80s, and you can read the materials on it too, a lot of developmental projects led by the World Bank and developed nations, caused a lot of environmental, social, and cultural damage because they were imposed from the top. They were taught by think tanks or governments or people, and they went into the developing world and say, we can do this here. But there was no opinion of the experience of the people who were being served sought. As a result, so many projects were built, like deforestation, cash crops, that actually end up destroying the very way of life that these people were trying to support. So emphasis here in this chapter, as we move into the dialogical self and dialogical education, is now he explaining what he has taught us, right, is the difference between the banking system and the problem-posing education, and the significance of having the voices of those who you claim to serve or educate incorporated within the decision-making process. Let's read some more. For the truly humanist educator and the authentic revolutionary, the object of action is the reality to be transformed by them together with other people, not other men and women themselves. The oppressors are the ones who act upon the people to indoctrinate them and adjust them to a reality which must remain untouched. Unfortunately, however, in their desire to obtain the support of the people for revolutionary action, revolutionary leaders often fall for the banking line of planning program content from the top down. They approach the peasant or urban masses with projects which may correspond to their own view of the world, but not to that of the people. They forget that their fundamental objective is to fight alongside the people for the recovery of the people's stolen humanity, not to win the people over to their side. Such a phrase does not belong in the vocabulary of revolutionary leaders, but in that of the oppressor. The revolutionary's role is to liberate, and the liberated with the people, and be liberated with the people, not to win them over. In their political activity, the dominant elites utilize the banking concept to encourage passivity in the oppressed, corresponding with the latter's submerged state of consciousness, and take advantage of that passivity to fill that consciousness with slogans which create even more fear of freedom. This practice is incompatible with a truly liberating course of action, which, by presenting the oppressor's slogans as a problem, helps the oppressed to eject those slogans from within themselves. After all, the task of the humanists is surely not that of pitting their slogans against the slogans of the oppressors, with the oppressed as the testing ground, housing the slogans of first one group and then the other. On the contrary, the task of the humanists is to see that the oppressed become aware of the fact that as dual beings, housing the oppressors within themselves, they cannot be truly human. This task implies that revolutionary leaders do not go to the people in order to bring them a message of salvation, but in order to come to know through dialogue with them both their objective situation and their awareness of that situation, the various levels of perception of themselves and of the world in which and with which they exist. One cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the world held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. The starting point for organizing the program content of education or political action must be the present existential concrete situation reflecting the aspirations of the people. Utilizing certain basic contradictions, we must pose this existential, concrete, present situation to the people as a problem which challenges them and requires a response, not just at the intellectual level, but at the level of action. We must never merely discourse on the present situation, must never provide the people with programs which have little or nothing to do with their own preoccupations, doubts, hopes, and fears. Programs which at times in fact increase the fears of the oppressed consciousness. It is not our role to speak to the people about our own view of the world, nor to attempt to impose that view on them, but rather to dialogue with the people about their view and ours. We must realize that their view of the world, manifested variously in their action, reflects their situation in the world. Educational and political action which is not critically aware of this situation runs the risk of either of banking or of preaching in the desert. So these are some deeply instructive passages and require us to understand these within the context of the argument of the book. So the project of education or political activism is to claim full humanity for all of us, right? The duality that exists amongst the oppressed is that they carry their own identity, but it is overwritten by the system of the oppressor. So they think the world in the language and vocabularies of the oppressor. And what he's saying in these passages is that mere slogans are not going to change things. You cannot win the people for revolution, because what that means is that you already have a revolutionary project and you just need their bodies. All they need to do is change their affiliation from their former oppressors to you. That is not going to work. It is not going to work as a political program, but also as an educational program. A transformative educational program must realize that its purpose is to enable people to claim their full humanity, and that it must be crafted through dialogue between the teacher and those that he or she is trying to teach and serve. Similarly, between the political elite, there should be no elite anyway, and the people that they are so-called trying to liberate. And the engagement must be authentic in a sense that it must go to the people, like the leadership or the teacher, and say, what is your lived experience? How do you see the world? What needs to be changed, right? And then take those ideas in a dialogic form and share your own ideas, but never as we have the idea to change your life, you just lend us your bodies. That's what he's trying to forestall in any revolutionary moment. And you can see now that he's combining the project of education with the project of politics, and he says at one point that politicians must do it because after all they must also become teachers, right, in the process of liberating people. But that liberation must happen with a dialogical engagement with the people. And if that doesn't happen, then it's just one kind of slogan competing with another kind of slogan, or it is kind of like preaching to the choir, or worse, preaching in the desert where no one is listening to you. So over and over, he's emphasizing and reminding us that the project of education and the content that's included in it must be informed by the people themselves, right? And its project must not just be cursory. Its project is to claim full humanity and transform the system into a just system in which everyone can claim their full humanity. So that's what I get from this paragraph. But primarily the focus in these passages is on mere sloganeering, right, or mobilizing the people and their bodies for a political cause in which they themselves have not participated, which they have not informed. So kind of a very informed critique of populism or even leftist politics, where an elite emerges and tries to incorporate people with the hope that they can train the people later. That is what he's trying to discredit, both in education but also in active politics. So let's read one more passage and see where we can end today's conversation. When educators and politicians speak and are not understood because their language is not attuned to the concrete situation of the people they address. Accordingly, their talk is just alienated and alienating rhetoric. The language of the educator or the politician, and it seems more and more clear that the latter must also become an educator in the broadest sense of the word, like the language of the people, cannot exist without thought. And neither language nor thought can exist without a structure to which they refer. In order to communicate effectively, educator and politician must understand the structural conditions in which the thought and language of the people are dialectically framed. It is to the reality which mediates men and to the perception of that reality held by educators and people that we must go to find the program content of education. The investigation of what I've termed the people's thematic universe, the complex of their generative themes, inaugurates the dialogue of education as the practice of freedom. The methodology of that investigation must likewise be dialogical, affording the opportunities both to discover generative themes and to stimulate people's awareness in regard to these themes. Consistent with the liberating purpose of dialogical education, the object of investigation is not persons, as if they were anatomical fragments, but rather the thought language with which men and women refer to reality, the levels at which they perceive that reality and their view of the world in which their generative themes are found. So we are now approaching the crux of the matter in terms of developing a dialogical mode of education, right? And the basic ingredient of that is to access, right, the world in which the people live, right? What is their objective reality? How do they think about it? And if they think about it, there must be a structure to that thought, right? Because the structure makes language possible. And that is what he's calling their thematic universe, right? What are the larger thematics of structure within which they think of their life? There is also a reference to generative objectivity, generative thought. So do keep in mind, I'm thinking that generative here means the same as Erik Erikson had theorized, that we all have certain natural impulses to think the world, to act in it, right? And so the idea is the dialogical education will not be a top-down education, but in developing the program of that education, we will actually go and sit with the people and talk to the people and see what are their generative impulses. Of course, their generative impulses are to be freer, to have better lives for themselves and for their own children, to understand the world in which they live, right? Against the objective reality in which they live. That must inform the project of education, and that will only happen if the educator actually talks to the people and tries to understand the larger structure within which an individual or a group makes an utterance. Now, the same program will then also apply to politics, reflection, and practice, meant to develop a praxis of education and of politics. So what's coming across here is the idea of the thematics, right, and the generative context within which that thematic and that structure develops, which he is going to explain in the next stage. But for right now, to conclude, we have now reached in our discussion of the dialogical education, which he calls different things, dialogical mode of education or problem-posing education. And one thing is clear, that he is also seeing it as a political project. But in both the cases, what it absolutely relies on is not a top-down understanding of the people or the peasants or the workers, but which tries to learn from the people through their lived experience, how they verbalize it, what kind of language they use to describe their world, right? With the ultimate purpose of developing a content of that educational system that is liberating and doesn't reinstall the old hierarchies of oppressor and oppressed, both in education as well as in politics. Now, there are references here to Feuilletor's work, which I have not been able to find in English, but if I do, I'll probably do a separate lecture here. But please do keep in mind that this book, as we read it, it defines its concepts, right, and then weaves those concepts through further refinements as we read more. And in this chapter, it is obviously becoming very clear that Freire is now trying to discuss as to how this problem-posing mode of education will be developed. And he's also trying to connect it to the issues of politics. So that's all I have for this chapter. I hope this was useful to you. I will be back with the next reading and discussion pretty soon. If you have any questions, any concerns, please post them in the comments and I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you so much for your support, and as always, I'm grateful for that, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.